Welcome to our final installment of Comp Ed Week. My name is Emily. I am the marketing manager for Handbooks, and I'd like to welcome you to Nancy Seminar's webinar, Building an Academic Foundation, Strategies for Teaching Arguments. At this time, you all are on mute, but if you have questions that you would like to post for Nancy, you can do so using the chat feature. Feel free to chat your questions to either Macmillan Education or myself, and at the end of the webinar, Nancy will address your questions. Nancy Sommers needs no introduction, but I would like to give her one briefly. She has taught composition and directed composition programs for 30 years, and currently she teaches writing and mentors new writing teachers at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Her articles, Revision Strategies of Student and Experienced Writers, and Responding to Student Writing are two of the most widely read and anthologized articles in the field of composition. Her recent work involves a longitudinal study of college writing to understand the role writing plays in undergraduate education. Nancy is the lead author on Hacker Handbooks, all published by Bedford St. Martin's, and she is also the co-author of Fields of Reading. It's with great pleasure that I welcome Nancy and that I turn this webinar over to her.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, and hello to everybody out there. It's wonderful, wonderful to be with you. I like to imagine all of us sitting around a comfortable table, maybe with a cup of tea, and gather together to think about something really important for us, thinking about practical strategies for teaching argument. I look forward to answering your questions. At any point, though, just don't wait till the end of the presentation. If anything I say really in the spirit of argument is something that you want to question, you disagree with, you want further clarification of, please just post your question. It'll be fun to think together about your questions and to answer them. So I want to start our seminar today with the words of Robert Frost, because I think these words really set the context for argument. There are no arguments without ideas. As Frost reminds us, all there is to writing is having ideas. To learn to write is to learn to have ideas. I find these words really inspiring and instructive, the idea of having ideas, because they remind me that my work as a writing teacher is to open up the world of ideas for students, to provide opportunities for students to explore ideas in writing, and to help students participate as insiders in a lively exchange of ideas, because that's what college education is about. That's what it's for students to participate in the exchange of ideas. Yet, we also know how difficult it is for students to know what an idea is and to feel comfortable in an academic setting that values complexity and subtlety and nuances. All the research that's been conducted on college first-year students, research by William Perry, for instance, and others, show that most first-year students are not comfortable with ideas, not comfortable with complexity. They're most often defined as what Perry called binary thinkers, or either-or thinkers, that they imagine that there are only two sides to an issue. So it always seems to me that in college writing classes, much of our work as we lead students to understand what argument is leading students beyond these either-or positions to see complexity, to see that there are a range of positions and arguments that resist simple either-or positions. One of the things I take great pride in as a writing teacher is helping students make what I think of as one of the biggest and most important intellectual leaps in college writing, and that is to move beyond their either-or positions, to expand their worldviews, and to be able to say at the end of a writing class, I've become a person with things to say. That's my goal for all of my students, and I think I help students make this leap through argument. So let's start out, though, with a definition. As we tell our students, definitions establish common ground, and arguments rise and fall on definitions. So you, for instance, might disagree with my definition of what an argument is. So first of all, what isn't an argument? And I think that's really important when we talk about argument, use the language of argument with our students, because if our students have a different concept of what argument is from us, we're really running down very different tracks. So I like to say to students, argument is not a quarrel, not a heated exchange of angry opinions, not a series of verbal or written attacks. They often confuse argument with what they see on cable TV or hear on talk radio in a kind of crossfire approach, or in the kind of approach in which people nail their opponents to the wall. So what argument is, as I think of it, is let me read to you really the way I define it to my students. Argument uses evidence and reasoning to convince an audience to accept or consider, and there's a difference, as we know, between accepting or considering, but both are important, a writer's position, a position on which reasonable people disagree. At the heart of argument is an issue which invites more than one reasonable answer. So there are lots of key terms here that have to be unpacked for students when we talk about argument. The first, of course, is evidence. What is evidence? And evidence is different depending on what discipline a student is writing in, but in general, we think of evidence as facts and statistics and examples and expert opinion, but there are no arguments without evidence. And then we talk about reasoning, a way of drawing conclusions and making assumptions and weighing options. And then, of course, audience. Arguments are written to and for readers who don't necessarily agree with our positions, who have their own positions. And so as writers, and this, of course, is what's so important in audience, is that we have to anticipate that our readers might not agree with us and that they have their own assumptions and arguments. The part, though, I find most interesting about this definition, and that I spend almost the entire semester in one way or another talking with students, is this idea that at the heart of argument is an issue which invites more than one reasonable answer. And this, of course, is what is at the heart of academic life. This is where complexity and counter-argument comes into play. And this, in fact, is how students learn to speak to people who disagree with them, because they learn that there is more than one reasonable answer and that the world isn't divided into either-or positions. And I like to say to students, welcome to academic life. You are being invited into a world in which there are more than one reasonable answer to any good questions. Welcome to it. Participate in it. When we talk about academic argument, of course, we often, and this is quite common in many of our classes, we use the metaphor of a conversation. And we say academic argument is a conversation. And we ask students to write arguments and enter research conversations by being in conversation with other writers and thinkers who have explored and studied their topic. And I think that that preposition in conversation with other writers and thinkers, is so important to students to understand that they are in conversation. They're not alone. They're not in a void. They're entering into an area where other people have thought about this topic. And so there will be disagreement, and that's the point. Disagreement is a good thing, that if they enter into a territory in which there is no disagreement, they probably have entered into an area where there's no debate and there's no real idea. There's just a lot of statements of fact. One of the hardest things for students is to figure out, if I'm going to enter a conversation, what are entry points? How do I enter? How do I figure out what the conversation is about, what people are saying, who's in it? So as I was revising a writer's reference, the 8th edition, and some of you might actually have the book in front of you, and you could turn to page 361. As you'll see, a lot of the material that I'll be using as examples in this webinar today comes straight from the 8th edition of a writer's reference, because these are issues that I thought a lot about as I was revising the 8th edition. So what you see here in this slide is my way of helping students find an entry point into a research conversation. And these are the kinds of questions that you would want your students to ask when they're writing researched arguments, because these are the kinds of questions that help them understand the research conversation, the arguments, and questions such as, well, who are the thinkers? Who are the writers? Who is in this conversation? And what are the positions that they have taken? What are the claims that they have made? Because that's the first level of understanding what the conversation is about. The next level is how and why do the major writers or thinkers disagree? And that's inviting students to understand that this is an exciting conversation and that disagreement is really at the heart and at the nature of that conversation. And then here's the entry point for the student. Once they understand what's been said, the areas of disagreement, the point for student is to start saying, okay, what has been said, but what hasn't been said and what needs to be pointed out. And that's the entry point for students, to be able to say, here's an insight that I haven't heard, or here's something I can add. And what I wanted also for students to have are some ways, some kinds of statements to help them find these entry points, by helping them understand some ways of saying, well, here's some key details that have been overlooked, or some researchers have concluded X from the evidence, but they could also conclude Y. And you might find these kinds of statements, these kinds of questions helpful for your students in many of the kinds of assignments, not just the research paper. Okay, so any good argument has a thesis, and here's my thesis about argument. And that is that argument is a habit of mind, a method of learning, and not just a single assignment. I think too often our students have difficulties with argument because we reduce argument to a single assignment, and we teach argument as that assignment. So what I would like to suggest in our webinar today, and of course I'm eager to hear your responses to my thesis, is I'm suggesting that from day one, that is the first day the students come into our class, we start thinking about how we can inculcate argument as a habit of mind, a method of learning. And the first point would be to help students to think like writers and become curious about ideas. And when I think about this, the reason it's important to me is that when I think about one characteristic of all good college writing, I would say it's curiosity, that all good college writing starts with curiosity. And I want students to start from day one asking questions and knowing that the problems, the topics, the concerns, the issues that they care about are ones that they should pursue as writers. And so I might even in some kind of questionnaire ask them to start articulating their kinds of questions or interests or hobbies, and ask them questions, ask them to start asking questions about that, questions that they may then choose to research. One of the things I have a lot of fun doing the first week or so is giving students advertisements and asking them then to start asking questions that they don't have answers to. And to me, that's one of the key things I love to teach students. Students often come into a first-year writing class thinking they have to have the answers to questions, or that writing is just a matter of writing down what it is that they know. But I want to turn that on the head and say, no, that where writing starts is by asking a question or thinking about questions that you don't have an answer to. So this is an advertisement that you'll find in Writer's Reference on page 87. It's an advertisement for equal exchange. And I use this as a collaborative activity on, let's say, the second day of class. And it has a real purpose. For instance, we all want students to work together in groups, and we want them to collaborate. We want them to be good peers to each other. So part of what I want students to do is to work in groups and to start asking questions about this advertisement and to become comfortable with disagreement, that there may be one student in their group who sees it one way and another student who sees it another way, and to start hearing it around something in which they can all have an opinion about, they can all have a thought about. They don't need a lot of expertise to be able to read this advertisement. So I encourage students and give them some questions to think about. I want them to look at the language of the ad. I want them to start asking questions of what they see in this text and what they observe, but also what's missing, what puzzles them. When they look at this, what questions do they want to ask about this text that they don't have an answer to? And students look at this and they right away, it empowers them, because right away they can ask questions such as, well, what does empowering really mean? And what kind of exchange is going on? And can empowerment be exchanged? And these are the kinds of questions that I want the students to ask, and to really be comfortable asking the questions and hearing their peers talk about it and maybe having other points of view. But when I say and urge you to think about argument as a method of learning and a way of being in the class, what I'm suggesting is that every text that students look at and think about and how they work together in their peer groups are opportunities to encourage them to ask questions they don't have answers to be curious, all ways that lead them to becoming people who can have ideas and argue those ideas. So another activity I use during the first few weeks of class 2 is to get students to look at websites, because websites are such rich text to take apart. And this is one that you would find in a writer's reference on page 385. It's an interesting website that is advertising something called Cube Control. And it is a website advertising this Cube Control, which is to help for internet monitoring. And as you can see, it's suggesting that internet monitoring is better for business, it's better for employees. Well, all students, they've worked. They have opinions about whether or not their employer should have this kind of surveillance. And so I want students to work in peer groups and start becoming comfortable hearing opposing perspectives and entering debates. And so this is my opportunity already to introduce the language of counter-argument. I want students to be able to say to each other, it might be true, but couldn't we also see it this way? Or here's something missing from your perspective. Or could a reasonable person draw a different conclusion? So the website, any website, getting students to talk about it, develop positions, and posing counter positions, I think this is the kind of method that encourages students and develops their habits so that when we ask them to write arguments, they're already primed for it. It's something that seems natural to them because it has become so much a method of learning in the writing classroom. Okay. So let's look for a minute at the most sort of single element of an argument, and that, of course, is the thesis statement. And, you know, I'd love to have a virtual show of hands and just ask you, do your students have difficulty writing thesis statements? And I can just imagine that most of us would be raising our hands. The thesis statement is really difficult. It's difficult for me as a writer. It's difficult for my students. It's hard for students to write arguments when they don't have a clear idea of what makes an effective thesis statement. So in a writer's reference, this is how I define what makes an effective thesis statement for students, that it's a central idea that requires supporting evidence. Its scope is appropriate for the assigned length of the essay. It's focused, it's specific, it's a promise to readers, and it is often one or more of the following: your answer to a question you've posed, the resolution for a problem you've identified, a statement that announces your position on a debatable topic. As you, I'm sure, have experienced, many students confuse the idea of a thesis. They often think that a thesis is a statement of fact. They often think a thesis is a question. And so that's why I like to define for students that a thesis is the answer to a question. I find that students learn that very quickly. And in fact, one of the things that I like to ask students to do in their introductions in their essays is to pose a question and then to have their thesis be an answer to the question that they pose. I think it's important too for students to have the language of thesis, so that when they work in peer groups, when they're revising, they can say to themselves, oh, I guess my thesis is a question. It's not the answer to a question. Oh, I think I haven't announced my position in the topic. So at least they can, when they're talking to themselves, thinking about their thesis, they have specific language to use. One of the most important things in writing a thesis is that the thesis has a so what to it. And I love to use this expression, so what, and students like it too. I'll give you an example. A student was writing a paper about the shift from print to online news, and his thesis was there is a shift from print to online news. So that is a thesis, is kind of a thesis without a so what. So what? It's kind of a statement of fact. Why would that thesis need to be argued? So what happened when the student went through this putting your working thesis to the so what test, he was able to revise the thesis to be something more like the shift from print to online news provides opportunities for readers to become more engaged with the news and participate as producers, not simply as consumers. And that, of course, is a much more interesting thesis. So how do I use this? Well, one of the things I always ask my students to do when they hand in papers, no matter what draft it is to hand in what I call a Dear Reader letter, which is their way of saying to their peers and to me as a reader, to their Writing Center tutor, some answer to some question that I want them to think about and that will help me as a reader of their work. So I want students to think about what is the so what to their thesis, and will any reader disagree with their thesis? If so, what might that reader say? And one of the things that I find is when the students, even if they don't have a so what to their thesis when they turn it in, when they write this Dear Reader letter and think about it, they're already thinking about how to revise their thesis and make it more interesting. These are questions also I give students to use when they're working together in peer groups, because it's a way in which they can help each other revise their thesis. But the so what also is a great phrase that students catch on to it right away. And when I do a thesis workshop with my students and ask a student to write his or her thesis on the board, the students will right away say, well, what's the so what to it? And whenever that happens, I'm always excited, of course, because it seems to me some real learning has happened. So let's talk about reading for a moment. Too often I think we forget to talk about reading when we talk about writing. And let me just offer this what I think of as just a wonderful quotation from a student at Austin Community College. And the student said, the best way to become a good writer is to become a good reader. The more you take from a reading, the more you have to give as a writer. So again, if we had a virtual show of hands and I asked you how many of your students have trouble as readers, I think most of us would raise our hands. And I think that's just something we need to think more about when we talk about argument, because our students have to learn how to read arguments. They have to learn what to look for when they read arguments. They have to understand what argument is being made. They have to learn to talk back to the argument. They have to learn to disagree. They have to learn to use the so what questions and ask of the readings, why does this thesis need to be argued? What has the author overlooked? And so one of the things that is very important when we think about strategies for teaching argument is really to ask ourselves, how are we teaching our students to read arguments? So one of the things I developed for Writer's Reference was a way for students to evaluate the ethical, logical, and emotional appeals as a reader, because this is a way for students to really realize that every argument that they read is built upon ethical, logical, and emotional appeals. And again, students need entry points into these readings. And one entry point is a way for them to say, well, are these appeals appropriate? Are these appeals balanced and legitimate or lopsided and misleading? So you'll find in a writer's reference that I really break out for students the ethical appeals that they may ask, the questions that they may ask of any argument. Is the writer informed and trustworthy? Is the writer fair-minded and unbiased? How does the writer use sources? How does the writer describe the views of others and deal with opposing views? And these are questions that I want my students to ask of their readings, because I think these terms are important terms and give them entry points when they are going to analyze and argue with the readings. The same for looking at the logical appeals of a reading. Is the evidence sufficient? Is the reasoning sound? Does the argument contain any logical fallacies? Are there missing or mistaken premises? Again, entry points for students in reading arguments. And emotional appeals. Again, one of the important ways for students to read arguments. I think these terms are so important for students, the logical, the emotional, the ethical appeals that writers use, and they're not just important for students when they read arguments, but they're very important for them as writers, because as a writer, students have to establish their credibility, and they have to appeal to their reader's sense of logic and reason and their reader's values and beliefs. So in the writer's reference, this is something that I give students, how to use these appeals as a writer. So how can a student come across as trustworthy, fair, and reasonable? Do they acknowledge alternative positions? And again, how would I use this? I use this with students, again, asking them to answer these questions, getting them to work with their peers, and giving these as the kinds of questions peers should ask of each other when they look at the ethical appeals, the logical appeals, and the emotional appeals of the writing. Again, we talk a lot about transfer, what skills, what transfers from first-year writing to the writing our students do across the disciplines. And I think that one of the most important things for us to do to help students transfer the important lessons that we give them is to give them language that they can use when they're revising, language that they can use when they're writing elsewhere. And some of the most important language we can give them comes from rhetoric, comes from helping them really identify the emotional, logical, and ethical appeals that they are using as writers. So all arguments, of course, start with effective assignments. And I just wanted to give, in the short time that we have together, some of my own thoughts about developing effective assignments. I guess I would start going back to my thesis that I started with today, and that is argument is not a single assignment, that really argument is present. It's a method of thinking in all assignments. It seems to me we make a mistake, for instance, in which we ask students to analyze a text. We call it an analysis assignment, and we don't help students understand that at the heart of an analysis is really an argument, because what are we doing when we analyze a text, no matter what kind of text it is? We are saying to a reader, here's my reading of the text, here's my interpretation, here's a question I'm asking of this text, and here's my answer to this question. So it seems to me that as you're thinking about your assignments, always thinking about the role of argument, or the role for students to play in having positions, taking positions, and acknowledging other positions. So the first element I always think about when I construct assignments is to ask myself, is there room in this assignment for students to take a range of positions? And I think that this is an important question for all of us to ask, because there's nothing, I guess, more difficult than reading a tall stack of papers in which there is only one position. And so it seems as if all students were reading basically the same paper over and over again. So when you write assignments, always think about, it's almost as if, we all say, wouldn't it be nice if we could write our assignments to really understand what a student would need to know in order to write that assignment. But in many ways, it's good for us to just imagine what kind of thesis could come out of the assignment that we've constructed, and is there room in this assignment for students to take a range of positions, to avoid either or positions, and to encourage them to be able to anticipate and counter opposing points of view. The second thought I have about developing effective assignments for students to really learn how to argue is this question, Is there a clear rhetorical purpose for students' arguments? Is there a reason? Will students be able to have a so what because there's a clear rhetorical purpose? One of the assignments that I came across last year, I believe it was at University of Mississippi, was one I really, really liked. Students were asked as a researched argument assignment to research a campus organization, to learn as much as they could about the purpose of the organization, and then in a researched argument to make a case for why this organization should receive campus funding. And so there was a clear rhetorical purpose, and there was a real context for the argument. They had done research, and they had to make a case for it. I like that example because it really moved students out of the classroom. It made the argument seem as if it had a real purpose. And I think that too often we construct assignments sometimes that don't have a real purpose. And the next idea is one that I think about a lot, which is what kinds of assignments could I create for students that have real audiences, such as the op-ed, for instance, or to remix research arguments as oral or multimodal presentation. I love to give students op-eds, and actually I ask students to write op-eds twice during the semester because they're short assignments. The op-ed is 750 to 1,000 words, but it teaches so many important skills. In an op-ed, you can only make one point, but you have to make it really well. And I think this is, again, a kind of assignment that helps move students away from the 5-paragraph theme in which they think they have to have 3 points. Because in an op-ed, you get to make 1 point, but in doing that, you have to also anticipate counter-arguments. You have to think about assumptions readers will have. You have to think about all the elements about disagreement, counter-argument, evidence, reasoning, everything that we talk about when we talk about argument, but you have to do it in 750 words, and of course, it has a real-world context. I also like to ask students, after they've written research arguments, to remix them for an oral presentation, for a podcast, something that gives them a sense that their argument has a place in the world. So let's come full circle in this very quick webinar of ours before we move to your questions. All there is to writing is having ideas. To learn to write is to learn to have ideas. To be asked to write in college is to ask students to see farther, wider, deeper, and to go beyond the simple either-or positions, to see that the world is just more complex, and to see that the world is a place in which disagreement is actually a good thing. The pleasure of teaching writing, of course, is that there is just nothing more important to students than their success as writers. And so I take great pleasure in teaching writing and helping students become comfortable as academic readers and writers. I want to help my students participate in the world of ideas as insiders and help them, when I teach argument as a method of learning, to really help them explore questions that matter to them, to ask questions that they don't have answers to. Teaching argument really pulls students out of their worldview. It helps them expand that worldview, and that's really what college is for. I can't imagine more important work than the work that we do helping students become people with things to say and helping them become responsible, literate, thoughtful citizens who write their way through college and into the world. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions now and thinking together with you about your questions. Emily, I turn it to you.
Hi, Nancy. It's actually Annette. Emily had to
Oh,
drop off the call, but
okay.
we have one question so far, and that is,
Okay.
do you believe that providing templates for argument articulation and thesis statement formulation is valid for first-year writers, or are templates too restricting?
Great. That's a great question. In general, I think templates are too restricting. And I think the problem with templates is that the students don't really know where to go after the template, that they can very easily write a sentence that responds to that template. And you might even try this as a little experiment, which is to give students some templates and see what the second and third and fourth question looks like after the the template. So I think that they are restrictive, but I think that they are ways to help. That there are certain, I guess, templates that I think help students generate ideas. And so in those ways, templates can be very, very important in helping students understand how to use language that really helps them think about ideas. So giving them the kind of template that says, on one hand, there's this idea, and on the other hand, there's another idea, but I'm going to find a middle position, helps them to see that there are middle positions. But that may not be a sentence they'll actually use in their in their papers. And I think the templates that are used as thesis statements really reduce students' creativity and make writing seem a little dull and not interesting. So my short answer is the templates really work as ways to expand students' ways of thinking, give them ways to help them to see how arguments are not just either or, and yet then they have to move from that to formulating their own sentences. Great, thank you.
Okay, so we have around 5 questions that just came in.
Great.
One is similar to the last question. How do the use of rubrics restrict or assist students in knowing expectations?
Great. So I think the most important thing about a rubric is that it's used as a method of learning. So when rubrics, in my experience, don't work is when they're handed out with a graded paper. And so students see various categories by which their papers have been evaluated, but those categories have never been categories that have been used to help them construct their paper. So a rubric is only as good as it's a method of learning, it seems to me, because if it's only used as a method of evaluation, students can't learn from it. So I think a lot of thought needs to be put into the rubric as a method of learning. But for instance, if I were to write a rubric that has as elements something about counter-argument and has the writer acknowledged disagreement and responded to that disagreement, what I would do with that is use that as part of the assignment and as part of the lesson to help students learn these elements that are in the rubric. So the short answer is a rubric is great when it is part of learning and not so great for students when it's only used as their method of evaluation. Great.
Okay, so we have a bunch of more questions. In addition to this edition of A Writer's Reference and your focus on argument, you've also written about revision and responding to student writing. I'm wondering how your practice informs your theory, specifically your own research/classroom experience.
Let me just, how my own practice as a writer-teacher informs.
Your theory?
Okay. So All the work I do with a writer's reference comes out of a lot of research. It comes out of sitting in classrooms across the country, observing students, talking to teachers, sitting in writing centers. Take Thesis, for instance. I sat with a lot of students and asked them about the challenges they have constructing thesis statements. I talk to teachers. So I do research in different ways, formal research, such as the longitudinal study I did, and then, informal research where I really observe, sit in classrooms, sit in writing centers to really understand how students write and how to come up with practical solutions to help students. A lot of the research that I've done on revision really has shaped thinking about how to help students revise because what I found in the research was that students' concepts of revision didn't square with teachers' concepts. Students saw revision as really kind of exchanging words or proofreading, while teachers were encouraging them to develop ideas and rethink their ideas. And so one of the things now that I do a lot with my students is really try to bring out, right from the very beginning, an understanding of what assumptions they're bringing into the classroom about, let's say, revision, what revision is to them, and also about comments, because one of the things that is so important to me is helping my students understand why I write comments, the purpose of comments, the kinds of comments I'll write, so that they know how to use the comments. I also engage my students, and this is a kind of informal research. I'm always doing little informal researches where I, for instance, ask students to give me feedback about the feedback I give them. So I ask them to review the comments they've received from me and to tell me which of the comments I'm giving them are most helpful and why, and which are least helpful. So the short answer is I think I'm always seeing myself as a researcher in my classroom, always asking questions. And one of the reasons I've stayed a teacher all these years is that teaching each year is new and interesting because of the students in my classroom, but also because I'm always asking a question about my pedagogy. I'm always trying to understand, how can I do this better, or how can I be more effective? And as long as we keep asking questions, I think teaching just remains one of the most important and exciting professions I could imagine. Great, thank you.
Okay, another person asks, what strategies do you have for helping students explore and decide on an issue that matters to them?
Yes, great question. I like to have students really understand the link between their own interests and academic writing. So I like to get them to say, when we're working on researched arguments, I like them to start putting down some topics that really matter to them. Last year, for instance, I had a student who was really interested in Hello Kitty and Japanese fashion. And, she didn't want to write about it because she couldn't imagine that that was an academic topic. And so it was very exciting for her to find out that there are academics who've actually argued about Hello Kitty and written about questions about the meaning of Hello Kitty. And so I think it's really important for students to locate their interests in the academy and and so one method is getting students to identify the topics and questions that they care about and to start doing some searches and finding out the ways in which that topic has been researched, and again, finding entry points to find out what has been examined and explored and what hasn't, because that's the area, that place, that entry point, which is the place where students will get excited about research and will get excited about posing their arguments when they can find an entry point. When they feel as if everything's already been said, or that their job is just to be a recorder or summarizer of what others have said, I think then writing doesn't seem as interesting to them. Thanks.
I think that this one ties sort of into what you just talked about, helping them explore the issues, but someone asks, I like the idea of asking students to ask questions they can't answer. When I assign a research essay, I receive a lot of cliched topic choices. Do you have other recommendations to help students avoid these cliched topics?
Yeah, well, I think that happens, and this is an important topic for us to think about. I think that happens because there's a kind of sense, students come into that they've got to take on the big themes, or they have to take on, capital punishment and abortion and, immigrants' rights and, all these themes, which could, of course, lead to good papers, but often, the students feel that that's what research papers are. And so it's understandable why that happens in the beginning. I think another sort of way of thinking about it is what ideas within the context of the class have made it possible for students to go deeper into these ideas. So it seems to me that sometimes we make a mistake by not developing our writing courses around themes. If we have, for instance, students write about a different topic each time they write assignment, they never have an opportunity to develop expertise in the content. So if we develop writing courses that are thematically organized, let's say around food, for instance, always a great topic, students then can start to see some of the questions that are being asked. They can start to find within that theme some areas that really interest them or intrigue them, some questions that they would want to answer. So I think sometimes we have to ask, what opportunities in our classroom have we given students to build expertise around a topic? And when that happens, then I think the questions are less cliched. Great.
Okay. The numbers are getting smaller. Do you think asking the first-year students to respond to one idea or topic from a reading and create a thesis is better than providing them with a set of specific questions relating to the reading from which they must choose one to respond?
I think both. I think it depends on the reading. I think it's, first of all, important for students to be able to understand the reading. That's really, really important because they can't write about it if they don't understand it. But it's also important for students not to feel that there's only one reading, meaning one response to that reading. And so how we frame the question often suggests to them that there's only one answer or many different answers. So I would prefer to really give students opportunities to to ask questions. So again, it's what question are you asking of this reading that you don't have an answer to? What doesn't make sense to you? Whether you could ask some question that would allow you to look through the ethical appeal, the logical appeal of the writer is making, but some question that you want to ask of the text that would lead to a way of reading it would be the approach I would take.
Okay. One person asks, my students struggle with spotting logical fallacies and missing premises. How would you handle that?
I think I would start, I think that they can spot it sometimes when they're talking to each other. And so it might be something that they need a little practice in by getting them, to work with the either-or fallacy, for instance, or to work with stereotypes, for instance, or, to work with any of the logical fallacies, just by giving them sentences from everyday life in which they'll be able to spot them and to become more comfortable with, and to really argue with them. Because if they're not comfortable with the concept, and then they have to apply it to a reading that they're struggling to understand, then I think we're asking them to do two different tasks at once, which is an overload. So I would get them to play around with these concepts first with content that they're comfortable and familiar with. Great, thank you.
Okay. How long does the process of learning argument take for students to grasp? What is a realistic timeline for this in a college course?
I think the entire semester. I think, as I'm, I guess, suggesting, I think it's the work of the course, which is to really start right away getting students to ask questions, to be comfortable with disagreement, to be able to understand how to move beyond either or simple positions, to see that there can be many different positions to a question, to be able to respond to counter-arguments. It takes the whole semester because they're always shifting content. And so every time you learn content, you have to practice it again. And then you have to practice all these skills every time you write the paper. So it's definitely not something that happens in one assignment or even two assignments. It's really the work of college, because it's the work that students will do in every course, and we set them out on it. But I guess I would urge everybody to think about ways to incorporate these ways of thinking throughout the semester. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. A couple more. So someone asks, in general, how many major writing assignments do you recommend to assign in a semester-long class on writing arguments? And sort of a follow-up, do you use portfolios for argument classes?
Yeah, okay. So I think in terms of how many major assignments, that's hard to say, because it really depends on how long the semester is, and semesters really have quite a variety, a number of weeks. But in general, what I like to think of is either 3 or 4 major assignments, sometimes 3, but sequenced. So whenever I write an assignment, I like to say to myself, what would students need to know how to do in order to do this assignment? And when I ask that question, then I develop lots of smaller skills, and I have students do various exercises and sequence the kind of progression that might be anywhere from a half of a page to 2 pages, which are in many ways thinking drafts, ways to help them lead to the assignment. So it always seems to me that the best writing classes are ones in which students are writing every day. They may not be turning it in every day, but they're doing something. They may be writing something to prepare for class. They may be writing something to prepare for work in their peer group. But when I go backwards and say, what would my students need to know how to do this assignment, I think of lots of small exercises that are sequenced, that will lead them to the assignment. So I guess that would be my answer. And in terms of portfolio, I think portfolios are really important because they help students see their work and they keep their work together. But equally important is that reflective ability, that ability to learn from their successes and there are places in which they still need to keep working. And so I want to build reflection in right from the very beginning of the semester. And so the portfolio, the argument portfolio, I think, is only as good as the reflection and the opportunity for students to reflect on who they are and what they're able to do and their areas of improvement, something that they get to practice many times throughout the semester. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so
okay.
I just wanted to thank you so much for presenting your wonderful webinar. I want to remind everyone who's still on the line that the recording will be on macmillanhighered.com/comped, and it'll be there for you to view, or if you want to download it, that's also possible. So with that, thank you so much, Nancy.
Thank you, Annette, and thanks to everyone. It was really great to be in this webinar together. And if anybody has any questions, I really encourage you to just write to me. It would be great to hear from you. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.